at home around the world with a truly global session. I love the map behind you, Lucy. Ndanga Kamau, Kenyan international lawyer, specialist, I think, in international dispute settlement and public international law, founder of your own law firm, an international law practice based in The Hague, Netherlands, arbitrator, advisor, vice president of the ICC International Court of Arbitration, and president of the ICC Africa Commission.
That's me. Thank you, Marion.
It's you in part.
Well, indeed.
It's the bullet points, isn't it?
Correct. That's it.
What keeps you awake at night? Go on. I know the answer in part.
Well, several things keep me awake up at night, but I'll spare you the full picture. And I mean, one of the things that really keeps me awake at night is the development of affordable, accessible, efficient, and inclusive dispute resolution mechanisms around the world, but especially in Africa. That's my real passion.
Lucy Greenwood, independent arbitrator, specialises in commercial and investment disputes, chartered arbitrator, one of the small but growing band of women who are, trustee of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, Texas attorney and a solicitor of the Supreme Court of England and Wales. Now, I'm not going to ask you what keeps you awake at night, because I've been to have a look at your blog. And right. I think we get a bit of a clue there, Ndanga. We get there crude price volatility and energy arbitrations, the most recent thing. And then followed, or very shortly connected to, on boxes and socks, reducing waste in international arbitration. Is that fair?
That is very fair, and some might say there's a slight tension between the fact that I practiced almost exclusively in energy disputes for the last 20 years, and suddenly some might say I've had this sort of Damascene conversion, and I'm now banging the environmental drum quite as hard as I am. But I don't see that as a dichotomy. I think they are keys to my development over the last 20 years, and certainly on the environmental side, I'm very excited that people in the field are starting to wake up to the need not just to talk about arbitrating environmental disputes and climate change disputes, and that's something I haven't particularly focused on, but talking more about managing disputes in an environmentally friendly manner.
One of the things I thought that I would say maybe unites us is that I know that diversity and the push towards diversity in all of its aspects unites us. I think that we all feel that there has been progress in the last 20 years. Is that safe? Would that be a common thread that unites us? We share that belief, Ndanga?
I think I'll let Lucy start with this one.
Yeah, I mean, that's only because I've been around longer.
She does that.
She's been around longer. She can. No, I will start with that one because it is interesting looking back. I certainly think there is greater awareness of diversity, much greater awareness and understanding of the issues. Has there been an increase? Yes, there is certainly more. Women have more visibility than they did, and the statistics are improving, certainly in relation to the underrepresentation of women. And really, I think when you're discussing this, you do need to be narrow and focused on what you are addressing, because this is an incredibly difficult issue. And it throws up difficult issues depending on where you are in the world addressing it, and also where you are in your career. So there's all these sort of competing factors that interact when you're discussing the point. So if you're just looking at the underrepresentation of women, which I have studied now for well over 10 years, there is improvement. Of that, there is no doubt. I worry that we are going to get to a plateau. We're going to get to a level of complacency where we say we have reached good enough. But at the moment, there is still appetite for change, and we need to make sure that continues.
Yeah. Just picking up on that, I think on the point of the complacency, I think whenever we address questions of trends towards diversity, there's always this tension between, if you acknowledge the improvements, does that mean that you stop striving towards getting better. And so we're often sort of stuck and uncomfortable with acknowledging those gains. But I think it's important, because otherwise it makes the work of those who've been pushing towards diversity seem like it's ineffective, which is not true. And while I agree that there's been a trend towards diversity with respect to women, I think that there hasn't been enough of a development towards diversity with respect to other diversities, if you can call them that, with respect to regional representation, with respect to other forms of diversity. And that's where I'm starting to see the work of the community focusing on addressing those questions, on having those conversations. And I think that partly the reason we don't see that progress is to do with how we measure diversity.
Yeah.
So we measure diversity, I think, a lot looking at the number of appointments of women. And that's only one narrow aspect of the number of people and professionals involved in this sector. So if we were to look at it more broadly, if we were to look at counsel in law firms, if we were to look at counsel working in arbitral institutions and the leadership in those institutions, if we were to look at the private sector and who are the clients, the parties, and look at the composition of those teams, we might find that we're actually getting better and that there's more to be encouraged by than to be discouraged by. And on regional diversities, it's a complicated one. I think it's difficult to measure. But if we take it away from this international platform and look at what's happening in the different regions, for example, and I can speak to Africa because that's where a lot of my work is focused, we're seeing much more dynamism in that, in the inclusiveness of Africans in international arbitration and domestic arbitration, which is where most professionals will start their careers before they enter the international plane. So while we are seeing improvements, we may need to change how we measure and to change what we're looking at and broaden those data points, which I think will help all of us in feeling that we are working towards where we should be and where we haven't arrived at yet.
Oh, I like that idea of looking at it holistically. I've never thought about actually always putting the broad table across. It's not just the person at the sharp end, but the full team all the way back through the institutions, the client. No one presents it that way, do they?
Well, I would say they don't, because we have suffered, I'm quoting Jackie from the LCA in this when she said a few years ago, a dearth of data was her phrase in the international arbitration field. So Ndanga is absolutely right. You have to look at the whole spectrum. And as I mentioned, where you are in your career, you will see a very, very different picture in terms of diversity than, for example, what I saw starting out as a junior associate in a Magic Circle firm 20 years ago. But the problem is that we have not had access to the data to be able to monitor and measure this in the way that Ndanga rightly says we need to be doing. And it is incredibly difficult. And one of the real achievements of the pledge on equal representation of women was to make arbitral institutions and others who sign up to the pledge, but it principally bites on arbitral institutions, publish their data. And so when I look at the stats, I can show you that from my historic research, you see a big tick up in the representation of women once the pledge comes into play in about 2015, 2016. But part of that uptick is, I am sure, due to the fact that we are getting better reporting and not necessarily more appointments. It needs to be an open conversation to those who can monitor it and share your data on these issues.
Do you think, as we are now in the post-COVID world and we're looking at a new future, what's the impact is that going to have on the notion that we should be more data, a more holistic approach? Are you optimistic? Do you think it's having a detrimental effect or a positive effect? Ndanga, do you want to?
Ndanga, you jump in.
Well, you mean just on the data collection or more broadly with diversity, Marion?
Well, in many ways, you're starting to answer the question in that way. I mean, I personally think data is key. But I think that what's going to affect this move towards diversity now are two things: the shortage of money and a feeling. a desire to be risk averse. And I fear that that will cause a shuffle backwards into one's security zone. And I'm not sure that the moves towards a greater diversity are now firmly enough based for the world to continue moving smoothly forward.
I think I would agree with that. And if I look at it from sort of more developing jurisdictions perspective, but even a step before that, if we think about international arbitration as fitting into the rest of the world, so we're not an enclave that exists, that doesn't touch on other sectors of society and other sectors of the profession. If we think about it like that, then we have to think about the impact of the pandemic on society in general.
Yes.
And what we're seeing there, and it's still too soon to tell, but what we're seeing from reports that come from bodies such as UN Women is an almost certainty that the impact will be disproportionate on women. And that's because of the health crisis and because of the economic crisis and how our societies are organized. So if we move from there, from that starting point and say, we know it's going to have a disproportionate impact on women, then I think we can't expect that it will not have a disproportionate impact on women in international arbitration as well and in the legal profession in general. Now, if we acknowledge that, which I think we should, then the question becomes, what are we going to do about it? You know, we don't simply sit with that information and say, well, it's all, well, we're going to lose all the gains and you know, it's a disaster. Yeah. There's nothing we can do about it. I think what that tells us is we know enough that we have to act. And how we act, partly it's from collecting data, partly it's other mechanisms. But I think we should be conscious that there's nothing inevitable about the progress that we've made, whether that's to do with gender diversity or other diversities. We've seen that in crises, those gains are eroded very quickly and quicker than the time that it's taken to build them. So I think for our particular community, we have to now, as we imagine a post-pandemic world, even though we don't know when that will be, we have to take steps to ensure that we don't lose those gains that we have.
With regards to the collection of data, one thing I had done last year with the great help of a trainee from Freshfields is analyse 230 international arbitration conferences that took place in 2019. It seems extraordinary that we can have that number, but anyway, we looked at the conferences and we looked at the breakdown of male-female speakers. Again, understanding and being very aware that there is far more significant, I would say, issues in the lack of diversity in our field than just the underrepresentation of women. But frankly, it's a somewhere to start, and it's easy to analyze. And what was it was very, so that is very good to have that as a baseline, so that we can look at 2020, which will be an extremely different year in terms of conferences. I mean, you couldn't get a more different situation that we're in now. But to look at the 2020 webinars, as they will mainly be, and there are some virtual conferences, full conferences happening. So the ABA, for example, is running its conference virtually at the moment, I think. But to see whether there is a change in who is asked to speak in the virtual world versus who was asked to speak during the conferences last year. So I'm quite excited to see if there is a difference, how that translates.
So what are we going to do? What should, before we narrow in on the personal, what do we think are the steps that could now be put in place, could be taken to ensure the drive, and what individually are we going to do? What one small step are we each going to take? Because it just takes lots and lots of baby steps, doesn't it?
In two parts. The first is what we should be doing more generally. And here I would say, firstly, there are no simple answers. So I don't think that we have any magic solutions. And even if we had all the data about, from all these different sections, I'm not sure that we would resolve the problem. So the first thing is to acknowledge that this is a complex problem to solve, and the question of diversity and inclusiveness is one that has no easy answers. And to be comfortable with that complexity, and to be able to have those conversations without alienating each other, without prioritizing different types of diversity, and allowing ourselves to confront this question with its multiple facets, so that it is possible to promote geographical diversities as well as gender diversity in the same room, in the same conversation, on the same conference panel. So that's the first thing, is that we must allow ourselves to embrace the complexity. Now, on the second question as to, or the second part as to what I will do personally, I'll give you a bit of an analogy. I like painting pictures. So, you know, we're occupied these days with the questions of environmental harm and our responsibility to ensure that we cause as little harm to the environment as possible. Now, if you stood at the mouth of a river, where the river goes into an ocean or a sea, and you saw, you know, bits of plastic, and you measured the water and you saw it was completely toxic, you wouldn't try and solve the problem by staying in that spot and continuing to measure the toxicity and looking at the amount of plastic and hoping that it will get resolved. So what you would do is you'd go upriver, and you'd make your way up towards the source of the river, and you'd look at that whole landscape, and you'd see the tributaries, you'd see the farmland probably dumping fertilizer into the water, you'd see the industrial zones in the cities and the villages, and you'd try and solve the problems there. You'd be trying to see, how can we stop this mess, this debris, this poison getting to the ocean? You don't stand at the mouth of the river. And that analogy for me is what we should be doing with respect to diversity in our field. So at the moment, all that we're measuring is how many arbitrators who are women, how many arbitrators from different geographical regions are being appointed. And we're somehow hoping that this data will get beyond certain percentages, even though we know that the source of these numbers is not the arbitral appointments, it's further upriver. It's in the schools, it's in the high schools, it's in the primary schools, it's in the universities, it's in the law firms, it's in society. So my pledge is to go upriver and to spend more time looking at how I can contribute to those conversations in primary schools and high schools and universities and other places, which will ensure that the flow that's coming towards this measuring point, where we're counting the number of arbitrators being appointed, has a chance of changing. And of course, you know, as you both know, as we discussed, my area of geographical focus is in Africa, but it's not an exclusive focus, but I would encourage others as well, is let's not stand at the mouth of the river. Let's go upriver and see what we can do about those numbers further up the source of these numbers. And that's my two-part response.
Ooh, that's an amazing response. Both of you have given me so much to think about. And because my responses are again twofold. And Lucy, it's building on that article that you circulated earlier this week about the number of interruptions that the Supreme Court judges were experiencing, and the disparity that the data was showing between the interruptions of men and women. And it seemed to me that two small baby steps I can take is, firstly, in any conversation I'm in, is to look at who expects to be heard and who is entitled to be heard, and to make sure that both are given a voice. Because I think that I interrupt, I'm an interrupter, and I think I also sometimes passively sit back and let people interrupt. So I'm going to consciously try and monitor that. And Ndanga, following on what you said to me, because you said it's all very well, you know, calling out and saying where's your diversity, but put a list down. Yeah. You know, it's not enough just to call it out. You've got to say, and here are the alternatives. So I got a book. Excellent. Okay, and it's got fish on it, and I didn't realise when you talked about going up to the walls. And I am going to write down every time I read something, hear something, see something from somebody who I didn't know before. I'm going to write down their name, so that when I'm asked to call it out, I can also gently say, here's some alternative names. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And really what you're saying, it sums up what I have been focusing on for many years now, is and Ndanga talked about this, is having an adult conversation about this. Yeah. Having the vocabulary to talk about it. And I think that we have got there almost in there. We're certainly getting there if we're not already there in the international arbitration community. There has been enough awareness raising, just to have general discussions of these issues, that people feel more comfortable speaking up and saying, well, actually, this isn't a balanced list of potential arbitrators, or, well, let's look at this law firm team that you've just put on my matter. It's not diverse. And so that is a really big step forward. It really is, and we should acknowledge that, that we've achieved that as a community, and that we should build on that level of awareness and engagement that we're finding now. I always encourage junior associates and middle associates just to hang on, get to the mouth of the river, just hang on, hang on to
that toxic raft.
Exactly, just hang on and get there, because again, just looking at women, we have huge issues in terms of pipeline leak, and just even if you have to step down. I mean, you know, Marion, with your career, you have to be flexible, particularly if you're working with children, and I always encourage people, just step down, but don't step off. Just hang on there so you can get through to the mouth of the river and come out the other side. So, and that's really, it's everyone, the way that people can do that is different for everyone. But however you manage it, just stay on board.
Absolutely. Marion, what I had said was that we must remain defiant. And that wasn't to do with going off and burning our bras in the street. It really has to do with this, the recognition, which I think we all have, no matter where we find ourselves in this sector and generally in society, that there is an inequality and a lack of representation that we don't like and we think is unacceptable. And unless we remain defiant and keep at those things that will get us closer to equality and closer to full representation, then we can't get tired. I mean, sometimes it feels, one feels exhausted, one feels like you can't believe we're still having these conversations and so forth. You hear sort of these expressions of frustration, but we don't have a choice, because the alternative is status quo, which I think we all agree is not where we want to be. So we keep at it.
Oh, I look forward to continuing these conversations, ladies. Have a good day.
Thank you so
very
much.
Thank you, Marion. Thanks for the chat.
All right.